The air in the auction yard hung thick and heavy, a humid cocktail of diesel fumes, sawdust, and the sweet, cloying smell of hog manure from the nearby stock pens. It was June of 1969, a sticky Saturday afternoon, and Silas Blackwood was hunting for a bargain. He wasn't looking for much, just a decent set of used cultivators for his old Farmall M. The ones his father had left him were worn slick, the sweeps rounded down to nubs after 30 years of fighting Iowa's black, stubborn soil. He moved through the rows of iron relics, his boots kicking up little puffs of dust. His eyes, the color of a faded summer sky, scanned the equipment with a practiced efficiency. He could spot a cracked weld from 20 paces, could tell by the shade of rust if a machine had been left in a field or kept in a barn. His hands, calloused and permanently stained with grease around the knuckles and under the nails, stayed tucked in the pockets of his worn denim overalls. He was a quiet man, built like the fence posts he drove into the ground. Not tall, but solid and unyielding. A ripple of laughter, sharp and arrogant, cut through the low murmur of the crowd. Silas didn't need to look. He knew that sound. It was Earl Thompson, and it was usually aimed at something or someone Earl considered beneath him. Silas rounded a hulking, sun-faded combine and saw the source of the commotion, parked side by side, in a contrast so stark it was almost comical, were two tractors. One was his, the 1951 Farmall M he'd driven into town. Her red paint was mostly gone, faded to a dull, chalky pink and peppered with patches of orange rust, especially around the fenders where the mud clung thickest. The engine was streaked with the black residue of a dozen minor oil leaks he was always chasing. She wasn't pretty, but she was his. Every nut, every bolt, every wire was a familiar friend. He'd rebuilt her carburetor on the kitchen table and timed her magneto by ear. She was paid for, free and clear, just like the 160 acres his grandfather had broken with a team of mules. The other tractor was Earl Thompson's brand new John Deere 4020. It was a monument of modern farming, a gleaming green and yellow beast that looked like it had rolled off the pages of a magazine. It had a fully enclosed cab with tinted glass, giant cleated tires that looked like they could climb a mountain, and a chrome exhaust stack that pointed to the sky like a silver finger of accusation. A small antenna on the roof meant it had a radio, maybe even air conditioning. It was the kind of machine that made a man dream of expansion, of more land, of bigger yields. It was also the kind of machine that came with a monthly payment book, thicker than a Gideon's Bible. Earl was leaning against the front tire of his new Deere, a smug grin plastered on his face. He was taller than Silas, softer in the middle, his hands clean. He was holding court with a half-dozen other local farmers, men who were either already in debt to the bank or thinking about getting there. "Look at that thing," Earl said, hooking a thumb toward the Farmall. His voice carried across the yard. "You gonna plow with that museum piece, Silas? Or just charge folks a nickel to look at it?" The men around him chuckled. It was an uneasy sound. They all knew Silas. They knew his father and his grandfather before that. They knew the Blackwood family had farmed that same piece of ground since the turn of the century. But they also saw Earl's new tractor and the promise it represented. Progress was a powerful drug. Silas stopped, his gaze meeting Earl's. He didn't say anything. He just looked. He saw the pride in Earl's eyes, but underneath it he saw something else too, a flicker of insecurity, the anxiety of a man who owed a lot of money. Silas knew that look. He'd seen it on his father's face during the lean years. His father's most frequent sermon, delivered over a sputtering engine or a broken axle, was about the two kinds of chains that could bind a farmer, the ones that pulled his plow and the ones that led to the banker's door. "One set you can take off at the end of the day," his father would say, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. "The other follows you to bed at night." "Seriously, Blackwood," Earl pressed on, emboldened by Silas's silence. "That old thing burns more oil than diesel. How do you even get parts for it anymore? Go digging in a scrap heap." "She runs," Silas said finally, his voice low and even, the words tasting like dust in his mouth. "Oh, she runs," Earl mocked, slapping his thigh. "Fellas, did you hear that? She runs. Well, my 40-20 here doesn't just run, she flies. I'll have my corn in the ground while you're still trying to get that antique to turn over." Silas just gave a slow, deliberate nod. He let his eyes drift from Earl's face to the gleaming green paint of the new John Deere, then back to the faded red of his own machine. He knew what they all saw, a relic, a stubborn fool clinging to the past. But Silas saw something different. He saw a tool that he understood completely, a machine with no secrets and no masters, save for the man whose hands were on the wheel. He saw freedom. And in the gleaming green paint of Earl's tractor, he saw a cage, gilded and comfortable. But a cage nonetheless. He turned without another word and continued his search for the used cultivators, the sound of Earl's laughter following him down the row of silent, waiting iron. Before we get deeper into this story, I want to ask you all something. Have you ever been laughed at for being careful with your money? For sticking to the old ways when everyone else was chasing the new shiny thing? Maybe it was about a car or a house or just the way you ran your life. Let me know down in the comments what that felt like, because Silas Blackwood knew that feeling all too well. It settled in his gut like a cold stone as he walked away from Earl Thompson and his circle of admirers, the quiet hum of the auctioneer's chant, a distant, meaningless drone. He knew in that moment that a line had been drawn in the rich Iowa soil, not between two farms, but between two philosophies, and only time would tell which one would endure. 2 weeks later, the mockery from the auction yard still echoed in Silas's ears, but it was drowned out by a much more immediate and terrifying sound. It was a sharp, metallic crack, followed by a sickening lurch, and then a final, grinding seizure that locked the Farmall's rear wheels solid. Silas was halfway through, ploughing his North 40, the sweet smell of freshly turned earth rising around him, when the world came to a violent halt. The engine died with a choked gasp. Silence descended, broken only by the chirping of a meadowlark on a nearby fence post. Silas climbed down from the seat, his heart sinking into his worn leather boots. He knew that sound. It wasn't a simple magneto failure or a clogged fuel line. It was deep. It was internal. It was bad. He spent the rest of the afternoon trying to get the tractor moving, but the transmission was locked up tighter than a banker's fist. Finally, defeated, he had to walk the 2 miles back to the house and get his old Ford pickup. He used a heavy chain and the sheer grit of the truck's granny gear to drag the crippled Farmall back to the barn. 2 long, black streaks carved into the gravel of the lane, marking the tractor's unwilling journey home. The barn was Silas's sanctuary. It smelled of old hay, engine oil, and the faint, earthy scent of the dirt floor. Light streamed in through the dusty, web-streaked windows, illuminating the motes of dust dancing in the air. For the next week, this became his operating theatre. He drained the thick, dark transmission fluid, finding the ugly glitter of metal shavings in the bottom of the pan. That confirmed his fears. A gear had shattered. Getting to it meant performing major surgery. He had to split the tractor in 2. Using a heavy-duty floor jack and a set of stout wooden blocks, he supported the engine and front end. Then, Bolt by painstaking bolt, he began the arduous process of separating the transmission housing from the engine block. The bolts were rusted solid, frozen by 2 decades of heat, cold, and moisture. He soaked them in penetrating oil, tapped them with a ball-peen hammer to break the rust seal, and then put his entire body into turning them with a long breaker bar. The muscles in his back and shoulders screamed in protest. One bolt, more stubborn than the rest, snapped off, its head flying past his ear like a steel hornet. He cursed, then methodically set up to drill out the broken stud and re-tap the threads, a miserable, time-consuming detour. All the while, the world outside the barn doors kept moving. Earl Thompson's new 4020 was a constant, distant hum on the horizon. From his own fields, Silas could see the steady progress as Earl's powerful machine chewed through the acres, pulling a 5-bottom plough that turned the soil in wide, perfect ribbons. Every morning, the coffee shop crowd at the co-op in town would get a report. "Earl's nearly done planting," someone would say. "Heard Silas's old Farmall finally gave up the ghost. Towed it back to the barn. Don't know how he'll get a crop in now." The scorn was palpable. It wasn't just Earl anymore. It was a general consensus. Silas Blackwood was a failure, a man too stubborn and too poor to keep up. He was letting his family's legacy crumble into dust, one broken part at a time. His wife, Sarah, tried to hide her worry, but he saw it in the tight set of her jaw when she brought him sandwiches and coffee in the barn. She never said a word against his methods, but the fear was there in her eyes. After 3 days of sweat and busted knuckles, he finally got the tractor split. The 2 halves sat there like a disemboweled beast. Inside the transmission case, the carnage was clear. The main drive gear had lost 3 teeth, which had then been chewed up by the rest of the assembly, scoring the other gears and filling the housing with shrapnel. A replacement was not something you could just pick up at the local parts store. The next day, he drove his pickup 80 miles to a salvage yard he'd heard about, a place the old-timers called the Iron Orchard. It was a sprawling, chaotic graveyard of forgotten farm machinery. Rusting tractors and combines from the 30s, 40s, and 50s sat in silent, crooked rows, being slowly swallowed by prairie grass and thistle. Silas spent an entire day wading through the weeds, fighting off wasps and spiders, searching for a donor. Finally, late in the afternoon, he found it. Another M, slumped and cannibalized, but its transmission case was still sealed. He paid the grizzled owner $40 for the right to pull the gear himself. It was another 2 hours of greasy, back-breaking work under the hot sun, lying on his back in the dirt and weeds to extract the part. He drove home, exhausted but triumphant, the heavy, oil-coated gear resting on a piece of burlap on the passenger seat like a hard-won trophy. The reassembly was just as slow and methodical as the teardown. He cleaned every part with kerosene until it shone, meticulously checking for hairline cracks or undue wear. He replaced the seals and gaskets, carefully applying a thin layer of shellac. He referenced an old, grease-stained service manual, its pages soft and worn as a much-read Bible. Finally, after a week that felt like a year, the Farmall was whole again. He filled it with fresh fluids, reconnected the battery, and hit the starter. The engine coughed twice, then roared to life with a familiar, throaty rumble that was music to his ears. He was 2 weeks behind schedule. The soil was getting dry. But as he drove the old tractor out of the barn and back toward the field, the setting sun glinting off its faded hood, he felt a grim satisfaction. He hadn't called a mechanic. He hadn't taken out a loan. He had faced the crisis with his own 2 hands and his own knowledge. He was poorer in time, but richer in a kind of hard-won independence that Earl Thompson, with his warranty and his service plan, would never understand. As he lowered the plough into the earth, the old tractor dug in, pulling steadily, faithfully. It was a small victory, but in the war he was fighting, it was the only kind that mattered. The next few years were a blur of hard work and tight margins. Silas made do. He got his crops in, maybe a little late, maybe not as picture-perfect as Earl's, but he got them in. The harvest of 70 was lean, the price of corn barely covering his costs for seed and fuel. He sold off a few more hogs than he wanted to that winter to pay his property taxes. He patched the roof on the barn himself, using tar and salvaged tin. Sarah planted a bigger garden, canning enough vegetables to see them through to the next spring. They lived a life measured in seasons and small economies, a life of making things last. Then, in 1972, the world changed. News trickled into the heartland of a massive deal, something the papers were calling the Great Grain Robbery. The Soviet Union, facing a disastrous harvest of their own, had quietly arranged to buy nearly a quarter of the entire US wheat crop, along with millions of tons of corn and soybeans. Overnight, the commodity markets exploded. The price of corn, which had been languishing around $1.25 a bushel, shot up to $2, then $2.50, then past $3. A kind of gold rush fever swept through the farming community. For the first time in a generation, it seemed like there was real money to be made from the soil, and no one was better positioned to ride the wave than Earl Thompson. He had bet big, and his bet was paying off spectacularly. With the value of his crops and his land soaring, the bank saw him not as a debtor, but as a visionary. They extended him even more credit. Earl bought the 80 acres that bordered Silas's south fence line, paying a price per acre that made the old men at the co-op whistle through their teeth. He traded in the 4020, which was barely 3 years old, for a brand-new, fire-engine-red International Harvester 1466. It was a monster, a turbocharged diesel powerhouse with dual rear wheels and a cab that looked like the cockpit of an airplane. He built a new ranch-style house for his family, set back from the road with a long, paved driveway. A new Buick Electra sat gleaming in the garage. Earl became the toast of the county. The bank manager pointed to him as an example of modern, aggressive farming. He was featured in the local paper, standing in front of his new combine with his arms crossed, a confident smile on his face. The article called him a pioneer of agricultural finance. The mockery aimed at Silas changed. It was no longer about his imminent failure. It was about his foolishness in the face of opportunity. "Can you believe it?" they'd say down at the diner. "Corn's at $3 and Silas is still tinkering with that old M. He could have used his profits as a down payment on a new machine, bought that quarter section north of him before the price went crazy. But no, he just squirrels it away. The boy's got no ambition." Silas felt the pressure. The boom was real. He had a good year, then another. For the first time in his life, there was a significant surplus after all the bills were paid. Sarah talked about maybe remodeling the kitchen, getting a new stove. But Silas, remembering his father's warnings, was cautious. The sudden prosperity felt fragile to him, like a thin sheet of ice over a deep, cold lake. Instead of buying land or new equipment, he did something that baffled his neighbors. He took a large portion of the money and paid off the last remaining mortgage note on the farm, an old debt from the 1950s that his father had taken out to build a new silo. The banker was surprised. "Silas," he said, leaning back in his leather chair, "you know, with these land values, you could leverage this farm, borrow against it, and easily double your acreage. Earl Thompson just bought another 160 acres last week." "I'd rather sleep at night," Silas replied simply, taking the cancelled note from the banker's hand. With the rest of the money, He bought a new set of tires for the Farmall, a new welder for his workshop, and put the remainder into a passbook savings account at that same bank, where it would earn a modest 4.5% interest. To everyone else, it looked like he was burying his talent in the ground. He was a man standing still while the world rushed past him. One evening in the late autumn of '78, Silas was in his barn, sharpening the blades on his disc harrow. The air was crisp with the coming cold. The harvest was done, his corn safely in the bins. It had been another good year on paper, but something felt different. The price of fuel was up again. The fertilizer bill had nearly doubled. He'd overheard men at the feed mill talking in worried tones about something called inflation. He was running a whetstone along the curved edge of a steel disc, the rhythmic scrape of stone on metal, a familiar, comforting sound. Through the open barn door, he could see the bright yard light over at Earl Thompson's new place, illuminating a vast and growing collection of machinery. Earl had just bought a brand new four-wheel drive Steiger, a huge articulated tractor that made his 1466 look like a toy. It was parked next to a new silver grain trailer. The sheer scale of the debt it represented made Silas's stomach clench. He paused his work, wiping the steel dust from his hands onto his overalls. He listened. The night was quiet, but in his mind he could hear a low hum. It wasn't the sound of an engine. It was the hum of interest, the relentless, invisible force that worked day and night, never sleeping, never stopping. He'd read a small article in the Farm Journal about the new chairman of the Federal Reserve, a man named Paul Volcker, who was promising to slay the dragon of inflation with the sword of high interest rates. Most farmers, flush with cash and high commodity prices, paid it no mind. But Silas did. He felt it in his bones, the same way he could feel a coming thunderstorm by the ache in his joints. A storm was coming, a different kind of storm made not of wind and rain, but of numbers on a ledger and promises that couldn't be kept. He looked at his own farm, the modest house, the old barn, the paid-for tractor sitting silently in the shadows. He had less than his neighbors, far less. But everything he saw, from the fence posts to the rooftop, was his. As the first cold wind of November rattled the tin on the barn roof, he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the core, that in the years to come, that small fact would make all the difference in the world. The summer of 1979 came in hot and stayed that way. The sky over Iowa turned a hard, bleached blue, and the rain simply stopped. Day after day, the sun beat down, baking the rich black soil until it cracked into a mosaic of deep fissures. The corn, which had sprung up green and hopeful in June, began to suffer. The broad leaves curled inward on themselves during the day, a desperate attempt to conserve moisture, turning a sickly, greyish green. By July, the tassels were emerging, stunted and pale, shedding their precious pollen onto silks that had already dried up and died. Silas walked his fields every evening, the dry dirt crunching under his boots like broken glass. He felt a familiar knot of worry tighten in his gut. A drought was a straightforward enemy, an act of God you fought with prayer and patience. But this time, it felt different. The drought was only one front in a wider war. The price of diesel fuel had climbed so high, he felt a stab of pain every time he filled the 50-gallon drum that fed his Farmall. The cost of nitrogen fertilizer, the lifeblood of a corn crop, had tripled in 5 years. Everything he had to buy was going up, while the price he was likely to get for his withered crop was starting to soften. The boom years of the mid-'70s, a fading memory. One afternoon, standing at his fence line, he watched Earl Thompson's giant Steiger tractor crawling across the neighboring field. Earl was cultivating, trying to break up the crust on the soil to conserve what little moisture was left. The machine was an awesome sight, a four-wheel drive behemoth that pulled a cultivator 30 feet wide. But it moved with a sluggishness that seemed wrong. A plume of black smoke, darker and thicker than usual, puffed from its chrome exhaust stack with every revolution of the massive engine. A few minutes later, the engine sound changed. It went from a deep-throated roar to a stuttering metallic cough, followed by a sharp bang that echoed across the parched fields. Then, silence. The giant machine sat motionless under the punishing sun. Silas saw a figure climb down from the cab. It was Earl. Even from a distance, Silas could see the angry, frustrated way he kicked one of the giant tires. For the rest of the afternoon, the Steiger didn't move. The next morning, a white service truck from the dealership in the county seat was parked beside it. Two mechanics in clean uniforms swarmed over the engine, their movements precise and practiced. Later that week, Silas saw one of the mechanics at the co-op, grabbing a cold soda. Silas, buying a new filter for his pickup, nodded to him. "Having much luck with Thompson's Steiger?" he asked quietly. The mechanic sighed, wiping a smear of grease from his forehead with the back of his hand. "What a nightmare," he said, shaking his head. Turbo went out. When it let go, it sent shrapnel all through the intake, scored 2 of the cylinders. We've got to pull the whole engine and haul it back to the shop for a complete rebuild. You know what a new turbo for one of those costs? $1,200. And that's before you even get into the block. He took a long drink of his soda. Earl about had a fit when we gave him the estimate. $6,000 minimum. Maybe more. Silas just nodded, a cold feeling spreading through his chest. $6,000. That was more than he'd paid for his first 80 acres. It was a sum of money so large it felt unreal. His own Farmall M, the entire machine, wasn't worth 1/10 of that. But if its engine blew, Silas knew he could find a used one in a salvage yard for a few $100s and swap it out himself in a weekend with a chain hoist and a set of wrenches. Earl's Steiger was so complex, so specialized, that he was completely helpless, a captive to the dealership's mechanics and their astronomical prices. The cracks in Earl's empire began to show in other ways. The new house, which had once been a symbol of his success, now seemed to mock him. The payments on it, along with the mortgages on the 1,000 acres he now farmed, were relentless. He'd borrowed that money when interest rates were 7 or 8%, but his loans, Silas overheard at the bank, were variable rate. And the news on the radio every morning was of the Federal Reserve, in its war on inflation, pushing rates higher and higher, 9%, 10, 12. The bank manager, a man who had once slapped Earl on the back and called him a genius, now had a permanent furrow in his brow. His calls to the Thompson farm were no longer friendly chats. They were inquiries about cash flow and collateral. The value of farmland, which had seemed like a sure bet, had stalled. It was no longer climbing. In some townships, it had even begun to slip. Suddenly, the massive debt Earl had taken on wasn't an investment in the future. It was a millstone around his neck. Silas saw the change in the man. The swagger was gone. Earl's face, once ruddy and confident, was now pale and drawn. He'd lost weight. When Silas saw him in town, Earl would just give a curt nod and look away, his eyes filled with a hunted, haunted look. The easy laughter was gone, replaced by a tense silence. The gleaming green and red machines that had been his pride and joy now sat idle. Monuments to a prosperity that had vanished as quickly and completely as the rain. The storm Silas had sensed was no longer on the horizon. It had arrived, and its first icy winds were beginning to blow across the plains. By the winter of 1981, The storm had become a full-blown blizzard. The word on the lips of every farmer, spoken in hushed and fearful tones, was 21%. The prime interest rate had hit a staggering, unthinkable peak. It was a death sentence for anyone carrying heavy debt. Operating loans for seed and fertilizer, which had been routine just a few years before, were now impossible to get. The banks, terrified by plummeting land values, were calling in their notes. The very foundation of the agricultural economy, the idea that land was the ultimate security, had crumbled. An acre of Iowa farmland that had been worth $4,000 in 1978 was now struggling to fetch $2,000. Men who had been millionaires on paper discovered that the paper was worthless. The county newspaper, once filled with stories of record yields and farm expansion, now carried a new, grim section: notices of foreclosure. The names were a roll call of the ambitious, the aggressive, the men who had followed Earl Thompson's lead. Every week, another family farm went on the auction block. Earl Thompson's notice appeared in early March of 1982. The advertisement was stark and brutal, a full page listing every worldly possession he owned: the Steiger Panther, the International 1466, the massive grain trucks and tillage equipment, 1,020 acres of prime farmland to be sold in separate parcels, the new ranch-style house, the Buick Electra. It was the public dissection of a life, laid out in cold black type for all to see. The day of the auction was grey and cold, a bitter wind whipping across the Thompson farmstead. A crowd of 200 people gathered, not with the festive air of a community auction, but with the somber quiet of a funeral. They were neighbors, fellow farmers, their faces etched with a mixture of pity, fear, and a grim sense of, "There but for the grace of God go I." They picked over the machinery, their hands running over the cold steel, their talk low and muted. The equipment, once so gleaming and new, now looked tired and forlorn. A thin layer of dust covered everything. A tire on the big combine was flat. Silas was there. He stood at the back of the crowd, his hands in his pockets, his collar turned up against the wind. He wasn't there to gloat or to scavenge. He felt a profound and aching sadness. He saw Earl standing near the house, flanked by a grim-faced man from the bank. Earl was a ghost of his former self, his frame shrunken inside his coat, his eyes vacant. He stared out over the crowd, but he didn't seem to see anyone. He was watching his world being dismantled, piece by painful piece. The auctioneer started with the smaller items, the tools from the workshop. The bidding was sluggish. No one had any money. The prices were heart-breakingly low. A heavy-duty drill press that Earl had paid $800 for sold for $75. A rolling toolbox filled with expensive wrenches went for $100. When the auctioneer moved to the tractors, a hush fell over the crowd. The monstrous Steiger, its engine now repaired at a ruinous cost, was the first up. It was a symbol of the era, of the ambition that had brought so many of them to this point. The bidding started low and barely climbed. The farmers who might have once dreamed of owning such a machine now saw it for what it was: an unmanageable expense, a devourer of fuel and capital. It sold for less than a third of what Earl had paid for it, the loss catastrophic. Silas watched it all, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. His survival felt less like a victory and more like a fluke of circumstance. He had no debt, his input costs were low. He had scraped by through the drought of '79, his smaller harvest still enough to cover his meager expenses. While others were paying 20% interest on their operating loans, Silas had used the cash from his savings account to buy his seed and fuel. He had patched his own tires, welded his own broken equipment, and kept the old Farmall M running with parts from the iron orchard, and his own ingenuity. His stubbornness, his refusal to join the great race for riches, had been his salvation. He hadn't prospered, but he had endured. And in the winter of 1982, enduring was everything. As the auctioneer moved down the line, Silas saw it, the John Deere 4020. It was the tractor that had started it all, the machine Earl had used to mock him that day in the auction yard so many years ago. It looked much older now. The tires were worn, the green paint was faded and scratched, and a spiderweb of cracks marred the glass of the cab. It was just another used tractor now, its glory days long past. The auctioneer began his chant, but the crowd was thin. The big money buyers were gone. $100 bill, who'll give me 100. Silas felt a strange compulsion. He watched as the bidding slowly, painfully, crept up to a few $1,000s and stalled. He thought of that day, of Earl's arrogant laughter. He thought of the years of quiet struggle, of the nights spent in the barn with busted knuckles and the smell of grease. He thought of his father's words about the two kinds of chains. He raised his hand. The auctioneer's eyes found him. "I have 4,000. Will you go 41? 4,100. Another man bid. Silas raised his hand again. 4,200. The other bidder shook his head and walked away. "Sold," the auctioneer cried, his gavel falling with a sharp crack. "For $4,200 to Silas Blackwood." A low murmur went through the crowd. Silas Blackwood, the man who never bought anything, had just bought Earl Thompson's old tractor. He ignored the stares and walked to the clerk's trailer to pay his bill. He paid in cash, with money he had carefully saved from the last few years. As he signed the receipt, he looked over and saw Earl watching him, a flicker of disbelief and confusion in his tired eyes. Silas simply gave a slow, deliberate nod, the same nod he had given Earl 13 years before. It was not a gesture of triumph, but of acknowledgement. The long, slow arc of time had finally come full circle. The weeks after the auction were a somber time in the county. The Thompson family moved away, disappearing into the anonymity of a city job in Des Moines. The new owners of their land, a distant investment corporation from Chicago, hired a farm management company to run it. The fields were still tilled, the crops still planted, but the soul was gone. The familiar sight of Earl on his tractor was replaced by hired men in company pickups. Silas brought the John Deere 4020 home. He didn't use it in the fields. Instead, he parked it in the back of his barn. Over the next few months, in his spare time, he began to work on it. He found the source of the oil leaks Earl had complained about and replaced the hardened gaskets. He tinkered with the diesel injection pump until the engine ran smooth and clean. He replaced the cracked glass in the cab and reupholstered the torn seat. He didn't restore it to showroom condition, but he made it sound solid and reliable. He made it a good tractor again. The community's perception of Silas had undergone a profound shift. The men at the co-op no longer saw him as a stubborn fool, but as a man of quiet wisdom. They would seek him out, asking his advice on how to repair an old piece of equipment or how to make a crop on a shoestring budget. He never preached or gloated. He just shared what he knew, speaking in quiet, practical terms. His farm, once seen as a relic, was now viewed as a model of resilience. He had become a living testament to the old virtues of thrift, patience, and self-reliance. The laughter had died long ago, replaced by a deep and abiding respect. One Saturday morning in the spring of '83, a dusty sedan Silas didn't recognize pulled into his lane. A man got out and walked hesitantly toward the barn where Silas was greasing his planter. It was Earl Thompson. He was thinner, his face lined with a weariness that hadn't been there before, but his eyes were clear. He wore a simple work shirt and jeans, not the crisp new clothes of his glory days. "Silas," he said, his voice quiet. "Earl," Silas replied, wiping his hands on a rag. They stood in an awkward silence for a moment. I heard you bought the old 4020, Earl said finally, looking at the ground. "She's in the barn," Silas said. "Needed some work, but she's a good machine." Earl nodded. I guess I came to say I'm sorry, Silas, for all of it, for that day at the auction, for the way I acted. I was a fool, a proud, arrogant fool." He looked up, his eyes meeting Silas's. "You were right all along. I built a house of cards, and I was so proud of how high it was, I never noticed it had no foundation. You built yours on bedrock." Silas listened, his expression unchanging. "A man can't see the future, Earl. You did what you thought was best." "No," Earl said, shaking his head. "I did what was easiest. Borrowing was easy. Signing my name was easy. You did what was hard. You fixed things. You waited. You endured. That's the hard part." He paused, swallowing. "The bank took everything. The house, the land, everything. We're renting a little place in town. I got a job at the implement dealership, the same one I used to buy all that equipment from. Now I'm the guy who sweeps the floors and helps unload the trucks." There was no bitterness in his voice, only a profound, exhausted sadness. Silas looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "Come with me." He led Earl into the barn to the 4020. It was clean, the engine block free of grease, the tires full of air. Silas climbed up into the cab and turned the key. The engine turned over instantly, settling into a smooth, powerful idle. He motioned for Earl to climb up on the other side. "I don't farm enough ground to need 2 tractors this big," Silas said, his voice barely audible over the engine's rumble. "And that 80 acres south of me, the first piece you bought, the corporation that owns it now, they don't care much about it. They'd just as soon rent it out for cash." He looked at Earl. The rent wouldn't be much, and a man would need a decent tractor to farm it. Understanding dawned slowly in Earl's eyes, followed by a wave of disbelief, then a raw, overwhelming gratitude that left him speechless. Tears welled up, and he turned his head away, ashamed. "She's paid for," Silas said simply, patting the steering wheel. "No chains on this one." Years passed. The farm economy slowly healed. Earl Thompson, farming 80 acres with a paid-for tractor, never got rich again. But he found something he had lost, a sense of peace. He and Silas became friends, a quiet, unspoken bond forged in the crucible of failure and grace. They would help each other during harvest, sharing labor and machinery, 2 old farmers who understood the true value of a neighbor. One cool evening in the late 1980s, Silas was in the barn with his grandson, a boy of 10 with bright, curious eyes. The boy was watching his grandfather work on the same old Farmall M, its engine apart on the floor. "Grandpa," the boy asked, "why do you still fix this old tractor? Why not get a new one?" Silas paused, wiping a smudge of grease from the boy's cheek with his thumb. He looked at the familiar iron parts spread out on the concrete. He thought of his own father, standing in this very spot, speaking the words that had become the compass of his life. "Well," Silas began, his voice soft with memory, "my father taught me that there are 2 kinds of chains that can bind a farmer. There are the ones that pull his plow through the dirt." He pointed to a heavy log chain hanging on the wall. "And there are the ones that lead to the banker's door. The first kind, you can take them off at the end of the day. You're your own man. The other kind, they follow you home. They follow you to bed at night." He looked down at his grandson, his gaze deep and earnest. "This old tractor," he said, tapping the faded red fender. "It's more than just iron and steel. It's freedom. It means we answer to no one but the seasons and the good Lord above. Never forget that." The boy nodded, not fully understanding, but sensing the weight and truth in his grandfather's words. Outside, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the fields. The land was quiet, resting. The old Farmall sat in pieces, waiting patiently to be made whole again, ready for another season, a silent, rusty guardian of a hard-won legacy. And Silas Blackwood, a man who had been mocked for clinging to the past, knew in his heart that he had saved the future.